Oh my God, Susan, is this my child?
The neon sign of the Midnight Plate Diner flickers like a dying pulse against the greasy windows. And then Lee Jae-won walks through the door. Not just any man, the Lee Jae-won, the dragon of the East River, the man whose name is whispered in fear from the high rises of Wall Street to the dark docks of New Jersey. He's not supposed to be here. A man who drinks $1,000 scotch doesn't sit on a cracked vinyl stool in a place that smells of burnt coffee and old regrets. This humble diner, tucked between a subway entrance and a boarded-up laundromat, is a world away from his throne. For 2 years, he has come here every night, a ghost haunting his own memories. Susan Carter has her back turned. She's wiping down the counter with practiced, weary motions, the same hands that once held his face in the moonlight of a Seoul penthouse. She reaches for a stack of clean mugs, and as she stretches, the kitchen door swings open. Fate doesn't just knock, it detonates. A small, sleepy boy, no older than 2, stumbles out, rubbing his eyes. "Mommy, I'm awake," the child chirps. Jae-won freezes. His heart stops. He stares at the boy's face, the high cheekbones, the intense set of the eyes, a perfect miniature mirror of the man in the tailored suit. The bell above the door chimes again, but the world has gone silent. Susan doesn't turn immediately. "I told you to stay on the cot, Ethan. I'll be right there, baby," she says in that voice, the velvet-smooth tone that has haunted Jae-won's James every night for 700 days. Jae-won can't breathe. He can't move. He can only stare at the woman who vanished into the night 2 years ago, the woman he thought he had destroyed to keep her safe, the woman who has been raising his heir in the shadows of a greasy spoon. The diner goes silent, that dangerous kind of silence that falls when a predator realizes he's been living a lie. The air becomes heavy with the violence that hasn't happened yet, but everyone knows is coming. Susan must sense the shift in the atmosphere. Her shoulders lock, her hands tremble. She turns slowly, her eyes meeting his across a formica counter that might as well be an ocean. The glass coffee carafe slips from her fingers. Everything happens in slow motion. Glass exploding against the checkered tile, dark coffee spreading like a bloodstain across the floor, white steam rising like the ghosts of their past. If you can feel the heat of this confrontation, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Chicago, Atlanta, Seoul? Let me know, because this secret is about to set the entire city on fire. The neon glow of Seoul's Itaewon district always looked like a watercolor painting melting under the relentless summer rain. 2 years ago, Susan wasn't a woman hiding in a New York diner. She was a student teacher living in a cramped rooftop apartment, working late nights at a small 24-hour convenience store to make ends meet. The rain that night didn't fall, it hammered, drowning out the city's roar and turning the narrow alleys into slick, treacherous labyrinths. She was closing the register when the bell above the door gave a frantic, jagged jingle. A man stumbled in, his presence instantly consuming the oxygen in the small room. He wasn't wearing the clothes of a common street thug. He wore a white dress shirt, now translucent from the rain and blooming with a terrifying, dark crimson stain across his side. "We're closed," Susan started to say, her voice trailing off as he collapsed against a shelf of ramen, sending plastic packages scattering like confetti. She should have called the police. She should have run out the back door. But as he looked up, the harsh fluorescent lights hit his face, and Susan saw something that paralyzed her. A pair of eyes that were fierce, intelligent, and desperately human. This was Lee Jae-won, though to her, he was just a man dying on her linoleum floor. "No hospitals," he rasped, his voice a low, jagged blade. His hand, large and calloused, gripped her wrist with a strength that spoke of a man who refused to let go of life. Susan didn't know why she listened. Perhaps it was the way his breath hitched in a moment of pure, unadulterated pain, or the way the rain outside seemed to isolate them in a world where only the two of them existed. She locked the door, flipped the closed sign, and helped him into the back storage room. For the next 3 hours, the only sounds were the drumming of the storm on the corrugated metal roof and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of Susan's heart. She used the store's first aid kit, her hands trembling as she cleaned a jagged graze that looked like it came from a world she only saw in movies. As she worked, Jae-won watched her. He didn't look at her like a victim or a witness. He looked at her like she was the first steady ground he had stepped on in years. "Why are you helping me?" he whispered, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Susan paused, her fingers stained with his blood. "Because it's raining too hard for anyone to be alone tonight." He reached out, his fingers grazing the skin of her forearm, a touch so light it was almost a question. In that moment, the dragon of the East River was gone, and in his place was a man who had finally found a sanctuary. He didn't know she would become his greatest weakness, and she didn't know he would become her entire world, and the reason she would eventually have to lose everything. The store back room became their universe, a sanctuary built of cardboard boxes and the smell of industrial cleaner. For 7 days, the man who held the keys to the city's underworld was nothing more than a ghost recovering in the shadow of a woman he had no right to love. Jae-won's fever broke on the 3rd night, and with it the walls between them began to crumble. They lived in the stolen moments between the ticking of the store clock and the rising sun. Susan would bring him warm tea and rice, and in return, Jae-won offered her stories of a world she had only ever seen in headlines, a world of cold steel and heavy crowns. He spoke of the burden of the Kong name, the weight of a legacy he never asked for, while she spoke of her dreams of teaching and the quiet life she craved. By the 4th day, the tension in the room shifted. It was no longer the sharp edge of survival, but the heavy magnetic pull of two souls recognizing their match. Jae-won watched her move with a grace that didn't belong in a convenience store, and Susan found herself drawn to the vulnerability he hid beneath his jagged scars. The first time he kissed her, the city outside seemed to freeze. It was a desperate, hungry thing, a vow made in the dark. For Jae-won, Susan was the only light he had ever truly touched, a woman who saw the man behind the monster. For Susan, he was a storm she didn't want to outrun. They spent the remaining nights tangled together on a makeshift bed, whispering promises that felt like prayers. "I can't stay in the dark forever, Susan," he murmured into the crook of her neck on the 6th night, his voice thick with a looming dread. "But I will build a world where you never have to be afraid." "I'm only afraid of the moment you walk out that door," she whispered back, clinging to him as if she could anchor him to her reality. They were naive enough to believe that a week of heaven could outweigh a lifetime of tradition. They didn't see the black sedans already beginning to circle the block. They didn't know that the syndicate's eyes were everywhere, and that a Mafia prince wasn't allowed to find peace in the arms of a woman from a different world. On the 7th morning, as the sun began to bleed through the shutters, the bubble burst. Jae-won's phone vibrated against the floor, a single ominous message from his father's council. The honeymoon in the shadows was over, and the war for their survival had just begun. The sanctuary didn't shatter with a bang. It died with the cold, rhythmic clicking of a gun being loaded. Jae-won stood by the window of the small rooftop apartment, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun, watching the 2 black sedans settle at the curb like vultures. He didn't need to see the faces inside to know they were his father's men. The council had found his weakness, and in his world, a weakness was something to be extracted or destroyed. Susan emerged from the bathroom, the steam from her showers still clinging to her skin, her eyes bright with a future that didn't exist. She moved toward him, reaching for his hand, but Jae-won flinched away as if her touch were a brand. He turned to her, his face a mask of sculpted ice, the warmth of the last 7 days buried under layers of inherited cruelty. "It was a mistake, Susan," he said, his voice devoid of the gravelly tenderness she had grown to trust. It sounded like a sliding blade. She froze, her hand hovering in the empty air. "Jaewon, what are you talking about?" "This, us." It was a diversion. He lied, each word a calculated strike to her heart. He looked at her with a calculated indifference, though inside his soul was screaming. He saw her confusion turn to a sharp, jagged realization, and he had to keep going. If he didn't make her hate him, she wouldn't run, and if she didn't run, she would be dead by nightfall. "I needed a place to bleed out where my enemies wouldn't look," he continued, stepping into her personal space, looming over her with the terrifying weight of his true identity. "You provided that, but the wound is healed and the chairman is waiting. You didn't actually think a woman like you had a place in a life like mine, did you?" The slap she dealt him was hard enough to sting, but it was nothing compared to the look in her eyes, the sound of a spirit breaking. "You're a monster," she whispered, her voice trembling with a grief that filled the room. "I'm a Kong," he corrected, his heart hardening into a fortress. He reached into his pocket and tossed a thick envelope of cash onto the bed. The ultimate insult, a payment for her services. "Take the money and disappear, Susan. If I ever see your face again, I won't be this generous." He walked out without looking back, his footsteps echoing like gavel strikes on the stairs. He climbed into the back of the waiting sedan, his jaw set, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't allow himself to look up at the rooftop window where he knew she was standing, shattered and alone. He told himself the lie that would sustain him for the next 2 years, that her hating him was a small price to pay for her breathing. He didn't know, as the car pulled away, that he wasn't just leaving a lover behind, he was leaving a son. The envelope of cash sat on the floor of that rooftop apartment for 3 days, untouched, like a pile of radioactive waste. Susan didn't want his money. She wanted the man who had looked at her like she was his entire world. But when the first wave of nausea hit her in the gray light of the 4th morning, the grief took on a new, terrifying weight. It wasn't just her heart that was shattered. There was a flicker of life deep inside her, a legacy of that week in heaven that she now had to protect from the very man who had fathered it. She knew she couldn't stay in Seoul. The chairman's reach was long, and Jaewon's generosity felt more like a final warning. If she was a weakness, she had to become a ghost. With a heart turned to lead, she packed a single suitcase, took the name Susan Carter, a nod to her grandmother's maiden name, and used every won in that cursed envelope to buy a one-way ticket to New York. She chose the city for its scale. It was easier to be a shadow in a place where everyone was a stranger. The first year was a blur of morning sickness and the sterile smell of public clinics. She found work at the Midnight Plate, a diner that felt like the edge of the world, where the coffee was bitter and the customers didn't ask questions. She lived in a studio apartment in Queens that was smaller than Jaewon's walk-in closet, but it was safe. Or so she told herself every night as she rubbed her growing belly, whispering apologies to a baby who would never know his father's name. When Ethan was born, the breath left her lungs. He had Jaewon's brow, the same stubborn set to his jaw, and eyes that held 1,000 years of intensity. He was a prince born in a burrow of strivers, a secret heir to an empire of blood and ink, sleeping in a plastic bassinet. Susan became a master of the mask. At the diner, she was the efficient, invisible waitress who never missed a refill. At home, she was the fierce protector of a boy who looked more like his father every day. She learned to live in the silence, to ignore the way her heart skipped when she saw a black sedan, and to bury the memory of the man she once loved under the grit of her new reality. She was a ghost, haunting her own life, convinced that as long as she stayed in the shadows, The storm of the Kong family would never find them. She didn't realize that in the world of the Mafia, shadows are exactly where the hunters look first. The midnight plate was a sanctuary of flickering neon and the low hum of a refrigerator that had seen better decades. Every night, precisely at 2 a.m., the bell above the door would chime with a familiar, heavy resonance. Susan didn't need to look up from the counter to know who it was. The air always shifted first, growing cold and pressurized, as if a storm had just stepped into the room. Jae-won took the same corner stool every night, his back to the wall and his eyes fixed on the middle distance. He was a man out of place, draped in wool coats that cost more than the diner's entire inventory, yet he sat there with the stillness of a statue. To the other patrons, he was just a wealthy eccentric or a brooding businessman. To Susan, he was a ghost she had been forced to serve for 6 months. She would slide a mug of black coffee across the formica, her movements mechanical and precise. She never met his eyes, she never offered a greeting. She wore the mask of the perfect, indifferent waitress, her Susan name tag pinned over a heart that felt like a bruised fruit. Jae-won never spoke. He would simply wrap his large, scarred hand around the mug, the steam curling around his face like a veil. He wasn't there for the coffee. He was there for the way her hair caught the light of the overhead lamp, for the sound of her footsteps on the linoleum, and for the agonizing, silent proximity of the woman he had tried to erase. He lived in a world of absolute power, yet here he was a beggar. He was fueled by a grief he couldn't name, a toxic mixture of the guilt from the breakup and the maddening suspicion that his soul had stayed in that rooftop apartment in Seoul while his body moved on to lead an empire. He watched the way her shoulders tensed when he moved, the way she leaned away from his space, and he felt the jagged edges of the distance he had created. He didn't know about the toddler sleeping in the back room on a pile of coats. He didn't know that every time he left a $50 tip on a $5 tab, Susan wanted to scream. He just sat in the amber glow of the diner, a predator turned protector, watching over the woman he had broken, unaware that the secret he had left behind was breathing just 20 feet away. It was a nightly ritual of penance and pain, 2 stars orbiting a black hole, waiting for the moment the gravity would finally pull them under. Every time the headlight beams of a black SUV swept across the diner's front window, Susan felt a cold spike of adrenaline that tasted like copper. It became a frantic, silent choreography. The moment those heavy doors thudded shut outside, Susan would move. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a ghost maker, erasing the evidence of a child's existence in the 60 seconds it took for Jae-won to walk from the curb to the door. She would scoop up the stray wooden train from beside the napkin dispensers, tucking it into her apron pocket with hands that refused to shake. She would snatch the half-finished drawing of a sun, colored with a vibrant, messy yellow crayon, off the back counter, shoving it into a drawer beneath the silverware. Ethan, tucked away in the storage room on his makeshift bed of old parkas, had learned the quiet game too well. He was a child of the shadows, conditioned by his mother's wide eyes and whispered shushes to remain a secret. One Tuesday night, the bell chimed earlier than usual. Jae-won stepped in, the scent of expensive tobacco and the cold night air clinging to his coat. Susan was mid-stride, a small, worn blue sneaker clutched in her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as his gaze flickered toward her. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the pit of her stomach. It was the first time he had spoken in weeks, and the sound nearly broke her resolve. "Just cleaning up," she replied, her voice a forced monotone. She dropped the shoe into a mop bucket, the plastic thud sounding like a gunshot in the quiet diner. Jae-won's eyes lingered on her for a second too long. narrowing with a sharp, predatory intuition. He moved toward his usual stool, his presence heavy and suffocating. As he sat, his hand brushed against a stray Lego brick Susan had missed, tucked right at the edge of the counter. He picked it up, the tiny plastic square looking absurdly small against his scarred palm. Susan stopped breathing. The silence was agonizing, thick with the weight of a truth that was screaming to be told. Jae-won stared at the toy, his thumb tracing the studs. For a fleeting moment, a look of profound, confused longing crossed his face, a glimpse of the man who had loved her in Seoul. "A customer left it," Susan blurted out, the lie tasting like ash. Jae-won looked from the toy to her face, searching her eyes for a map he couldn't find. He set the Lego down gently, almost reverently, on the formica. He didn't push, he didn't ask, but as he went back to his ritual of silent coffee and brooding grief, Susan knew the shadows are growing thin. She was running out of room to hide a son who was becoming more like his father with every passing hour. The stillness of the diner was a lie, a thin veil draped over a brewing storm. While Jae-won sat in his usual corner, anchored by the sight of Susan's hands moving over the silver espresso machine, he wasn't the only one watching. Across the street, nestled in the back of a nondescript sedan with tinted windows, a pair of eyes as sharp and cold as a winter morning followed every shift in the light. Uncle Sang-hoon, the eldest living member of the Kong Council and the man who held the purse strings of the empire's darkest enterprises, leaned forward. To him, Jae-won wasn't just a nephew, he was an investment that had begun to show a dangerous volatility. For months, the boss had been slipping away from high-stakes meetings and underground summits to vanish into the grimy streets of Queens. Sang-hoon had assumed it was a strategic move, perhaps a secret negotiation or a new territory grab. He never expected to find his nephew sitting in a $5 an hour stool, staring at a black waitress with the desperate intensity of a drowning man. "He goes there for the woman," Sang-hoon whispered, his voice like dry leaves skittering on pavement. He watched through binoculars as Susan paused near Jae-won's table, her posture stiff, her gaze averted. The one from Seoul, the one we were told had been handled. The betrayal stung Sang-hoon's sense of order. He remembered the reports from 2 years ago, the staged breakup, the payoff, the supposed erasure of the girl. To see her now, alive and serving coffee in a nameless diner, meant that Jae-won had defied the council's mandate. It meant the dragon had a soft underbelly, a weakness that had not been cauterized, but had instead grown into a silent obsession. But Sang-hoon's eyes narrowed as he saw something else, a flicker of movement in the diner's back window. A small shadow, the shape of a child's head, appeared for a fleeting second before being pulled back by a frantic hand. The uncle didn't need a DNA test to understand the math of the situation. 2 years of absence, a hidden life, a child with the unmistakable silhouette of a Kong heir. "A half-blood prince in a kitchen," Sang-hoon sneered, a slow, predatory smile curling his thin lips. This was no longer just a lapse in judgment. It was a threat to the purity of the lineage and the stability of the throne. To the council, an unauthorized heir was a liability that needed to be liquidated. As Jae-won stepped out of the diner and into the night air, unaware that his secret was no longer his own, Uncle Sang-hoon tapped his cane against the car floor. The order didn't need to be spoken. The hunt had begun, and the diner was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage. The stillness of the 3 a.m. shift didn't break, it evaporated. One moment, the diner was a vacuum of hums and shadows. The next, the front windows didn't just break, they disintegrated under a hail of suppressed gunfire. Glass rained down like diamond dust, sparkling under the flickering neon before embedding itself into the vinyl booths. Jae-won was out of his stool before the first shard hit the floor. His instinct was a predatory reflex, honed by a decade of war. He flipped the heavy Formica table, creating a barricade, his hand reaching into his coat for the cold weight of his Beretta. But his eyes weren't on the door, they were on Susan. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't frozen. The moment the glass shattered, Susan had dived across the counter, not for cover, but for the storage room door. A black-clad gunman kicked in the front entrance, the snout of a submachine gun searching for the boss's head. Jawan fired twice, a rhythmic thud-thud that dropped the intruder. But a second shadow appeared at the side window, aiming directly at the kitchen. "Ethan!" Susan's voice ripped through the air, no longer a waitress's polite tone, but the raw, guttural roar of a lioness. She didn't wait for Jawan to protect her. As the second gunman leveled his weapon toward the storage area, Susan grabbed a heavy, industrial-sized pot of boiling water from the range. With a strength born of pure, maternal desperation, she hurled it. The searing water and the heavy steel collided with the gunman's face just as he squeezed the trigger, sending his bullets into the ceiling. Before he could recover, Susan was on him. She didn't use a gun. She used a jagged shard of the broken coffee carafe. She drove it into the man's shoulder with a primal ferocity that made even Jawan pause. Her uniform was torn, her skin was sliced by flying glass, and her eyes were wide with a terrifying, holy rage. She stood over the storage room door like a shield made of flesh and bone. "Stay away from my son!" she shrieked, her voice vibrating with the power of a woman who had already lost everything once and would burn the world down before she lost it again. The storage room door creaked open, and a small, trembling hand reached out, clutching the hem of Susan's blood-stained apron. Jawan, standing amidst the wreckage and the smoke of his own gunfire, felt the world tilt on its axis. He saw the fire in Susan's eyes, the same fire that had warmed him in Seoul, and he saw the small boy hiding behind her legs. The realization hit him harder than any bullet. She wasn't just a waitress hiding a secret. She was a mother guarding his blood, and the war for his throne had just arrived at his son's feet. The gun smoke curled around the shattered light fixtures like spectral snakes. But the ringing in Jawan's ears wasn't from the gunfire. It was from the word son. He lowered his weapon, his gaze fixed on the boy who stood paralyzed in the doorway of the storage room. Ethan had Jawan's stubborn brow, his deep-set, soulful eyes, and the unmistakable, regal tilt of a head that belonged to the Kong dynasty. "Susan," Jawan breathed, the name cracking like dry wood. He stepped over the fallen gunman, his boots crunching on glass and spent casings. 2 years. I spent 700 days in a tomb I built for myself, thinking I'd saved you. And all this time he was breathing. He was here. Susan didn't back down. She stood her ground, the jagged shard of glass still clutched in a white-knuckled grip, her blood mixing with the spilled coffee on the floor. He was safe, Jawan. He was a ghost, just like I was, until you started coming here, until you brought your world back into ours. "I never knew," he whispered, a rare, raw agony breaking through his ironclad composure. He reached out a hand, but the flinch in Susan's eyes stopped him dead. "Why didn't you find me? Why didn't you send word? I would have burned the council to the ground for you." "And that's exactly why I stayed hidden." Susan's voice broke into a jagged sob that she instantly smothered with a fierce, protective glare. "You think I didn't want to tell you? I looked at his face every morning and saw you. I lived with the ghost of your touch every single night. But I remembered that morning on the rooftop. I remembered the ice in your voice when you called me a mistake. I believed you, Jawan. I believed I was the thing that would get you killed." She stepped closer, the fire in her eyes drowning out the amber glow of the diner's neon sign. "Your father's men told me that if I ever reached out to you, they wouldn't just kill me, they'd make you watch. They said I was a parasite on your legacy. So I chose his life over your love. I chose to be a waitress in a nameless diner so he could grow up without a target on his back. And now look at us." She gestured to the carnage, the blood, and the terrified boy behind her. "The moment you found us, the bullets followed. You say you wanted to save me, but all you ever brought was a different kind of death." Jae-won looked at the boy, then at the woman who had endured a living hell to protect his blood. The DNA of a dynasty wasn't in the wealth or the power, it was in the sheer, unbreakable will he saw in Susan's eyes. He realized then that he hadn't saved her 2 years ago, she had saved their future, and now the dragon would have to earn the right to belong to it. The transition from the ruined diner to the mahogany-paneled sanctum of the Kong Council was not a journey, it was a descent into a cold, clinical hell. Jae-won did not wait for the sun to rise. By 4 a.m., the city's shadows were alive with the sound of black tires screaming against pavement. He had left Susan and Ethan under a guard of 20 men, men who knew that if a single hair on the boy's head was disturbed, their lives would be forfeit. The council met in a windowless room beneath a high-end art gallery in Soho, a place where blood was usually exchanged for ink and ledgers. When Jae-won kicked the doors open, he didn't look like a CEO or a nephew. He looked like the monster they had spent decades trying to create, finally unleashed upon its makers. He shed his tailored coat, revealing the holster strapped to his ribs and the white shirt stained with the iron-scented reality of the diner's floor. "Jae-won, this is an unscheduled meeting," Uncle Sang-hoon began, his voice thin and oily, reaching for his cane. "We were just discussing the unfortunate breach at the diner." The sound of Jae-won's gun hitting the table was louder than any shout. He didn't fire immediately. He walked the length of the table, his eyes locking onto each of the 5 men who had signed the secret order to hunt a woman and a child. "You lied," Jae-won whispered, the sound vibrating with a lethal, low-frequency rage. "You told me she was gone. You told her I would kill her. You tried to prune the only living branch of my tree because you couldn't control the fruit it bore." "The lineage must be protected," another elder stammered, his face turning the color of ash. "A half-blood heir is a—" He never finished the sentence. Jae-won moved with a velocity that defied his exhaustion. He didn't just eliminate them, he dismantled the very structure they stood upon. One by one, the ink of their contracts was washed away by the blood of their betrayal. He stripped them of their holdings, their titles, and finally, their breath. When he reached Sang-hoon, the man who had orchestrated the 2 years of silence, Jae-won didn't use a bullet. He leaned in close, his shadow swallowing the older man whole. "You thought Susan was my weakness," Jae-won rasped, his fingers tightening around the collar of the man who had been his mentor. "But she is the only reason I haven't burned this entire city to the ground. You didn't just threaten a waitress, you threatened the queen of this empire." By the time the ink dried on the new mandates, the council was a memory. Jae-won stood alone in the quiet, blood-slicked room, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the sudden, terrifying lightness of being free. He had purged the old world to make room for the new. The ink was dry, the blood was spent, and for the first time in his life, the dragon was heading home to a place that finally had a heartbeat. The transition from the neon-lit grit of the midnight plate to the sprawling, silent elegance of the Kong estate felt like waking up in a different century. The limestone walls and manicured gardens were a fortress designed to keep the world out. But as Susan stepped through the grand foyer, her hand gripped tightly in Ethan's, she realized it was finally a place that could keep them safe. The air here didn't smell of old grease and desperation. It smelled of cedar, rain-washed stone, and a terrifyingly beautiful new beginning. Jae-won stood at the center of the hall, his silhouette no longer cast in the jagged shadows of a diner booth. He had traded the blood-stained white shirt for a soft cashmere sweater, a deliberate shedding of his armor. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, sealing away the ghosts of the council and the echoes of the sirens, the silence that followed wasn't heavy with violence. It was thick with the weight of a debt being repaid. He didn't speak to Susan first. He understood that to win the mother, he had to prove himself to the son. Jae-won moved slowly, closing the distance between his violent past and his fragile future. Then, the man who had never bowed to any king or chairman lowered himself. He sank to one knee on the polished marble floor, bringing himself eye to eye with the small boy who held the bridge of his nose and the fire of his soul. Ethan tilted his head, his gaze searching his father's face with a quiet, observant intensity that sent a shiver through Jae-won's heart. "I know I am a stranger to you," Jae-won said, his voice a low, melodic vow that vibrated in the stillness of the hall. "And I know that for a long time the world was a scary place because of the name I carry. But that ends today." He reached out, not to grab, but to offer his hand, palm upward. "This house is yours. This city is yours. I have spent my life building walls, but from now on I will spend every breath making sure you never have to hide behind them. No more shadows, Ethan. No more quiet games." Susan watched, her eyes shimmering with the first tears of relief she had allowed herself in 2 years. She saw the way Ethan's small fingers tentatively reached out to touch the scar on Jae-won's palm, and the way Jae-won's breath hitched at the contact. "I promise you a world of peace," Jae-won whispered, looking up at Susan with a gaze that asked for a forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. "I will be the shield so you can be the sun." In the golden light of the afternoon, the dragon had finally come home. The legacy of blood and ink had been rewritten in the language of a father's promise. And as Susan stepped forward to join them, the broken pieces of a convenience store romance finally clicked into the solid foundation of an empire built on love. The story of Susan, Jae-won, and little Ethan doesn't just end with a happy family in a mansion. It ends with the birth of a new kind of empire, one built on truth instead of secrets, and love instead of blood. Jae-won spent 2 years thinking he had to destroy his heart to save his life, only to realize that his heart was living in a quiet diner in Queens all along. Susan's journey from a heartbroken ghost to the queen of the Kong lineage proves that no matter how much the world tries to silence you, the truth always finds its way to the light. And Jae-won's transformation from a cold predator to a kneeling father shows us that even the most dangerous men are capable of redemption when they finally have something worth fighting for. If this story of hidden secrets, mafia betrayal, and a mother's unbreakable love touched your heart today, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of these epic sagas. Give this video a big like if you think Jae-won did the right thing by taking down the council, and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from: New York, London, Seoul, or anywhere else in the world. I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were Susan? Would you have stayed hidden, or would you have told him the truth? Share this with someone who believes that love always finds a way back home. Because in a world of shadows, sometimes the brightest light comes from the places you least expect. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.